Now, the last chunk of any paper, of any scientific or academic article, is usually some sort of conclusion. Now, depending on the scientific discipline, you might end up with a situation where you just put this conclusion into the discussion. So you just have discussion / conclusion, or discussion and conclusion. Sometimes you'll end up with a section that's conclusion and recommendations or something along those lines. But really what we're talking about here is just the last section of your paper, and we're just going to call it here the conclusion. Now, there's two key reasons for having a conclusion. Number one is just to provide a bit of a summary of the results. So that way, if anybody's just kind of skipping the whole paper and going all the way to the end and saying, tell me what's the meat of this paper, what's the most important thing about what you found, they'll find it right there at the front, center, in the beginning of the conclusion. The next thing they're really looking for, if they're just going straight to the conclusion, is some sort of recommendation. So what can I do with this new knowledge? So you've given me all this cool new ideas. Give me something practical, something tangible that I can do to take this forward one more step. And there's a couple of different ways of doing this, and we're going to talk through all of them. So let's just start off with that number one point: restate your key findings. So again, this is just a synthesis of the main 2 to 3 findings that you have discovered, that you've revealed, that you've shown in your paper. Now, this is in some ways going to kind of repeat what you have in your discussion section, but that's okay, because often people will just skip the middle of a paper and run straight to the conclusion. And we want to make sure that anybody who's reading the conclusion gets that information, gets those 2 to 3 key findings. Now, if for whatever reason you're having to write a really short paper that's like 8 pages long or something along those lines, you want to take a step back and think, where can I cut that repeated element out? And I would typically recommend people cut it out of the discussion. So if you've already synthesized your results in a discussion, take that out of there, put it into the conclusion instead, because you want to make sure that the results are specified, are detailed in a high level in the conclusion, because again, people might skip the whole thing and just go straight to the conclusion. So number one, restate your findings. Number two, provide some recommendations. And there's 3 different categories of recommendations that I think about whenever I'm looking at a conclusion. Number one, and probably the most important for 90% of scientific papers, give me some recommendations for future research. So where can I take this knowledge and then take the next step forward? This is not about the limitations of your study. This is not about, oh, I didn't do enough in my study. It's not about that at all. What it is about is saying, hey, I've taken us this far. You, the reader, anyone who wants to build off of this, here's how I would suggest you take this further. So it's kind of handing that baton to the next generation of researchers. It's handing this off to someone else who can take this forward and do something new and interesting with that. And there's a few different ways you can do that now. One way is kind of methodologically changing what you've done. So you might have done an exploratory qualitative study. And so your recommendation may be, take this topic area that I've already researched with some qualitative methods, some in-depth qualitative methods, and reproduce that study. But instead of using qualitative methodology, do a statistical analysis and do some hypothesis testings. So one of the things that you might have revealed in a qualitative study is that there's a few questions we still have around these issues, and that can then be the basis of forming some hypotheses. So that's one way. Just flip it up methodologically. So if you've done qualitative, suggest a quantitative. If you've done a quantitative research, suggest some qualitative research. The second way is to change the population that you're focusing on. So if you're focusing on this group of people, group A, say, okay, we would want, if you want to reproduce this study in a different way, same topic, same ideas, but change the focus from this population to population group B. That can help change the findings and give you some new insights into this area of research. So methodologically change, population of focus that you could change. You can also change any other kind of variable or topic of interest in your study, and you can get a new and different perspective on that piece of work. Now, don't get crazy with this. Don't go kind of completely radical and suggest, if you're doing a behavioral science research, suggest that somebody do a research study in physics. You're not trying to jump into a completely different frame of thinking or scientific tradition. You're really just taking us that one little next step. Where can I go from here? So that's number one when it comes to providing recommendations. Most important thing, provide recommendations for future scientists. The second most important thing, and I think this is really critical for any kind of applied research, any kind of action research, is that you provide some recommendations for practice. Now, whatever research area you've been investigating, ideally, what you're going to get from that investigation is some knowledge that can be put into practice. So give practitioners, however you would define the term practitioners, maybe if you're doing psychological research, maybe it's new practices for therapists. Maybe it's new practices for government agencies responsible for mental health. It just depends on your topic area, but whomever you think of as practitioners, in my field of computer science, I think practitioners in terms of programmers often. It's what can I give, what can I give programmers, advice that I can give programmers to change their way of thinking, to change what they're doing or how they're doing it. You could also think of it in an organizational perspective. So what information can I give to organizations to change the way they operate? So that's the second way, is practice. How can I provide some recommendations for practice? Now, this kind of gets dicey for a lot of researchers. They kind of feel a little insecure because they think, oh my gosh, this knowledge that I've created, it may not be kind of ironclad and like proven beyond the shadow of a doubt, so I don't want to give a recommendation for something that might be wrong. Look, that's not your decision. Your decision is really just to lay it out so that other people can kind of pick it up and figure out what to do with it. So providing some recommendations for practice is not taking responsibility for the way the organizations are putting that into practice. It's just putting out some ideas, some suggestions that organizations can use to take forward. Now, if you're really feeling insecure that organizations might be using this unethically, or that whomever you think of as practitioners might be misusing or misinterpreting your results, then just take a step back and think, what's the next most kind of easy recommendation to make? So if you're not secure about making a very, very precise recommendation, take a step back and just give a more general recommendation. So that way anyone reading this paper can kind of understand, here's where their thinking lies when it comes to doing something in practice. So it can just be a general approach. Now, the third kind of way of making recommendations is recommendations for policy. This often gets overlooked because people get really focused in on making impact, and impact often is affiliated or associated with kind of these grassroots movements with people on the ground kind of making things happen. But making recommendations for policy can really amplify your results. It can amplify the way your knowledge is being used. Now, again, take some caution here. You don't want to make a recommendation for policy that leads us into a really dangerous or difficult situation. Take a step back again, provide a more general kind of analysis, a more general understanding of how you see your results and how they could be used in a policy. Now, what I often find, especially in new researchers, is that they make recommendations for policy having no idea about anything related to policy. Now, I'm not saying you got to be a policy expert here, but you should know what are the general policy trends in your field. So that way, when you're making that recommendation, you're actually making a novel or a new recommendation and not kind of recommending something that people are already doing or that policymakers have been doing for 10 years now. So try to make a new recommendation for policy or just a new way of thinking. Policymakers aren't looking for you to prescribe to them what to do. They're not looking to say, hey, you scientists, tell me how to make a law. They know how to make laws. What they look to you is for new ideas, new ways of thinking, new empirically validated approaches for doing something in a certain way, for moving an agenda forward, for moving an idea into law, moving an idea into policy. So really think about how you can translate what you found into that space. And that may mean you have to take a step back and just provide a general narrative that they can pick up on so that they have something to refer to whenever they're creating new policy. So that's my general recommendations for conclusion. Typically, this is a very tight, short section, couple of paragraphs max. So again, with your recommendations, you're not going to be able to go into massive amounts of detail. It's just about providing a couple of key ideas, indicators, areas of interest that people can take forward. So number one, restate your results, because often people will just skip to the conclusion, read the conclusion, and then they need to know what you found. Number two, provide some key recommendations, and you can do this in 3 different ways. Sometimes you might want to do them in all 3 ways. Number one, create recommendations for scientists. 2, create recommendations for practitioners. And 3, create recommendations for policymakers so that anyone who's reading your knowledge that you've created, reading your research, can take it forward into the next stage.